You know what that means? It's time for Explain and Verify. Now, for South Africa to be protected, the country needs a well-equipped, well-resourced and combat-ready army. What went wrong, though, with the SANDF funding? Samgele?
Well, Bongiwe, indeed, South Africa needs a national army that is fit for purpose, ready to deal decisively with any threat to the nation. Well, hint, hint, President Ramaphosa. To answer this question about SANDF funding, let us listen to Deputy Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, General Bantu Holomisa, on what he had to say. Indeed, we also found the general. He was in the cabinet Lehotla saying, us South Africans know very little about the SANDF and war. Let's listen to what the general had to say.
We must all remember that the signals that the SANDF is struggling have been issued in the last 10 or 15 years. The defunding of the National Defence Force of South Africa led to us to say the state of readiness for our defence force, we cannot guarantee. We hope that the Department of National Treasury and the Cabinet will rearrange some of the priorities. Remember that the government of South Africa, especially the previous 6 administration, since 1998, they focus more on social security as opposed to military security. And as a result of that, the defunding of the defense force began. But I'm happy that President Cyril Ramaphosa had publicly said we are going to move away from 0.57% of the GDP to 1.7% of the GDP. That should help our defense force.
So, Samgele, what is the military funding benchmark for other countries with strong armies?
Well, Mbongiwe, most countries with strong armies spend a significant portion of their GDP on the army. Defense experts say a 2% of GDP of military funding is adequate. Let's look at some of South Africa's spending over the past few years when it comes to the military. Let's look at our first graphic. Military expenditure, 0% of GDP. For instance, if you look at 2011, it sat at about 1%. And then these are the successive years. For instance, if you go to 2019, that was one of the lowest which the government spent about of the GDP, going to just above 0.85% of the GDP. It went up again in successive years. That would be around 2020 to go to 0.95%. Then it decreased significantly, particularly when you look at military expenditure percentage of a GDP, particularly when you look, this is the World Bank, by the World Bank in 2023, going towards the lowest at 0.5%. Bongiwe, those are some of the numbers of a military expenditure of the GDP, Bongiwe, that has been spent over successive years, going from 2011, going towards the year of 2020, 2021, 2022, and ultimately this was a report compiled by the World Bank in 2023, Bongiwe.
And Samgele, then, when you look at this issue, let's take us through, in fact, some of the costs right now of the SANDF deployment so that we can be able to see just how things are looking, especially when it comes to some of the deployments there through the graphics.
Bongiwe, in our next slide, it particularly shows the spending of SANDF budget over the successive years, Bongiwe. Between 2024-2025, 52.4 billion rands was spent on the SANDF budget. That was the budget of the SANDF in 2024-2025. 2023-2024, Bongiwe, it decreased, Bongiwe, going to, for instance, this is 24, it increases, in fact, Bongiwe. In 2023-2024, it was 51.1 billion rands. In 2024-2025, Bongiwe, it goes to 52.4 billion rands. But in 2026-2027, it is projected to rise once again to 56.2 billion rands. And again, in the year 2025-2026, it is a projection projected rise of 53.7 billion rands. So successfully, you are seeing an increase in the SANDF budget within the country, particularly noting that some of the world's countries that are highly respected, you look at the United States of America, they spend billions and billions of dollars on their military. You go to the Republic of China as well, they spend billions of rands on their military. You go to Russia as well, they do the same, particularly noting that they are currently engaged in confrontation or war, if one may put it like that, with Ukraine. But if you look at the words of Ugandan President Paul Kagame, he's saying he's ready for any form of confrontation. They will deal with whatever threat of aftermath that was issued by the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, looking at the conflict currently between Rwanda, South Africa, DRC, Burundi, in the Great Lakes region. Remember what former President Mbeki had to say about that particular conflict last year, saying that this remains an issue, particularly dating back to 2003 when the SANDF was first deployed under that United Nations peace mission within that particular region. Bongiwa.
And it speaks to that Sun City agreement that has been spoken about this week, Samgele, that is said to, been at the time the panacea to resolving some of the issues there. But Samgele, when you look at the fact that the SANDF has been engaged in the DRC for decades now, let's speak about the issue of funding and what some of the experts have to say there.
Interestingly, the issue of funding has been the buzzword this week, particularly within the country, social media. Some media outlets have said that South African soldiers have been without bullets within the area of Goma, where they were engaged within that conflict with M23 and with the Rwandan armed forces and also with the DRC armed forces. But let's just look at the successive recent costs of the SANDF deployment in our next slide. Mozambique, you'd know that South African forces are deployed in Mozambique, if I'm not mistaken, in Cabo Delgado. We've got a deployment currently there trying to seize the insurgents of those rebels who are moving within that particular country. About 850 million rands was spent in the budget in the financial year of 2024-2025. So just next door in Mozambique, where our SANDF troops are currently deployed on a peacekeeping mission as well, the government and particularly the Department of Defense and Military Veterans has spent 850 million rands in the financial year of 2024-2025. So that is within this current financial year that we are concluding. In the next financial year, it would be rather interesting in the 2025-2026 financial year, how much will effectively be spent in Mozambique. Then you go to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the hot potato at this point in time. Many people are saying that South African armed forces, the SANDF, is highly underfunded and cannot compete or fight against the military wing of Rwanda. That would be rather interesting. For instance, South Africa in the DRC has spent above 2.4 billion rands in 2024-2025. 2.4 billion rands has been spent, Bongiwe, 2024-2025. It would be rather interesting. In fact, we should have had the cumulative amount that has been spent since 2003 when they were first deployed under former President Thabo Mbeki to Kgalema Motlanthe, that interim 8 months period he was president, then ultimately to Jacob Gedleyihlekisa Zuma within that 9-year period. He was at the helm of the country, and ultimately now within this 7-year period that Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa has been the president of the country, and ultimately the conflict escalating under the presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa. You saw the statements the presidency issued on this particular issue when it comes to President Cyril Ramaphosa, saying that it was the aggression of the Rwandan forces and M23 that ultimately cost the South African soldiers their 13 lives in that crosshairs that was currently there. You saw the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, that would be Angie Motshekga, saying that they were not engaged, they were not surrendering when they were hoisting that white flag, and there has been no instances where the SANDF has been left without any form of ammunition within that particular area. Bongiwa.
So, Samgele, then, when it comes to that, I'm keen to hear what someone like Helmut Heitmann, for example, would then say, especially when it comes to this issue of funding. As you say, it's been the buzzword this week. So what then do they say about whether or not these issues of funding should have deterred South Africa from taking this on, or even if you look at the issue of the SANDF being fit for purpose, when you listen to the Deputy Minister of Defense, who says that he could not guarantee the readiness of the SANDF, looking at some of the funding issues that have been raised 10, 15 years ago.
Those are rather interesting comments by the General himself, knowing that he's a former soldier in the Eastern Cape, in the Transkei himself. But let's bring in the experts, Mr. Helmond Heitman. Just a very good evening to you, sir. Just to get your sense of the SANDF, please explain to us the state of maintenance of SANDF military equipment, ranging from aircrafts, fighter jets, submarines, and other equipment that is there within the arsenal of the SANDF.
Basically poor to very poor. The Defence Force simply hasn't had the money to do it properly. Most of the Air Force's aircraft are not operational, are grounded. Most of the Navy's ships are alongside and can't operate. They're probably safe to go to sea, but they can't operate. And if you go to the Army, I think you'll find much the same with the bulk of the heavy equipment. And that spills over into things like training. If your aircraft aren't operational, your pilots can't fly enough to stay really current with their systems and their aircraft. And ships, crews, for instance, don't gel as a crew. You know, every individual member is perfectly trained for his post. But if a ship doesn't physically go to sea and operate, they don't start to learn together as a crew. If you take it a step further, the Gripen fighters, for instance, they've got no standoff weapons, they've got no anti-radar weapons, they've got no beyond visual range air-to-air weapons. The Rooivalk doesn't have a precision weapon, it's only got rockets and a 20mm cannon. And so it goes on. And that's the problem of the underfunding, which has been running for a long time. When we did the defense review starting in 2011, at that point, the Defence Force was about 50% underfunded. And it's just gotten a hell of a lot worse ever since. If you take the 2012 defence budget, about 35 million or so, then by now we should be spending close to 100 billion to be getting, if it was 50% underfunded then, and inflation. Then you add all the jobs that the government keeps giving to the Defence Force. It's not just 2,000, 3,000 troops in the Congo, or before that Mozambique. It's also doing the Zama stuff in support of the police, protecting power stations, being called out when there's a strike, dealing with sewage outlets, building bridges in the Eastern Cape and elsewhere. It's not going to work much longer. The bottom line is there's a limit to how much you can stretch something before it breaks. And the Defence Force, despite the best work of its people, and I mean, there are people in the Defence Force working minor miracles on a daily basis to keep it running, but basically it is no longer functional. And we saw this now in the Congo. We don't have the airlift we didn't have the airlift to move in quickly. We don't have the airlift to resupply, even if we had a safe airport. We had no air support for our troops on the ground.
Bringing in the issue of the Congo, is the Defence Force basically left high and dry and exposed, particularly within that area of Goma, looking at there were allegations that there's no ammunition, the fighter jets or airlift is not properly there? Are they underfunded and not properly equipped by the SANDF and the Ministry of Defence out there in the Congo?
Well, yes, they're out on a limb. Pretty much what has happened in the Congo is what happened in Bangui in 2013. In 2013, we still had enough of the Defence Force left that we could quickly respond. Other troops moved into the area, fighter aircraft deployed to Gemena, Rooivalk attack helicopters fighter aircraft to Kinshasa, Rooivalk to Gemena. And if we had gone for a counterattack, or if the Seleka then attacked our forces in Bangui, we could have responded effectively. Today, we cannot do any of that. Now, the troops on the ground in Goma may or may not have adequate ammunition. They certainly had adequate weaponry, apart from armored vehicles. I would like to have seen some Rooivalk armored cars there, for instance. But they had artillery, they had good base defense weapons, but no electronic countermeasures against drones, limited electronic systems in terms of some of the stuff that the other guys are doing. And yeah, while resupply was difficult, resupply is now impossible with Goma Airport closed. There's no other way to get anything there, short of taking another airport in the Congo and securing it, and then trying to ram through an overland corridor, for which we simply don't have the forces.
Is the current Falcon, the Rooivalk, and particularly the Griffins, are they fit enough if there were to be an airstrike of some sort? Are they fit enough to go to the Congo? Are they first generation? Is there technology left behind? Are they fit for purpose to fight and engage against the Rwandan air forces?
If we were to give the Rooivalk and the Gripen suitable weapons, they can do the job. The Rooivalk does need an upgrade. I mean, it dates back to the 90s. It needs an upgrade, but it's still an outstanding helicopter. And just given a standoff precision weapon, it can do the job. The Gripen is still a first-line aircraft. It's an outstanding aircraft. Again, it needs the weapons. With just dumb bombs, you're not going to do that job. Particularly now with the either the Rwandans or M23 having surface-to-air missiles, and not just shoulder-launched ones, but bigger systems, you also need an anti-radar weapon, for instance, which, as far as I know, the Air Force doesn't have. So the aircraft are fine, except they've not been serviced, they're not all operational. The crews, there's nothing wrong with the pilots, the weapons officers, except they haven't had enough time in the aircraft to be current. But the big gap now is the weaponry.
Looking at the statements that have come out, particularly from the Rwandan President Paul Kagame, and a very diplomatic statement coming from President Cyril Ramaphosa, except that particular word in a statement of militaya, which seems to have pissed off President Paul Kagame, knowing that he's an army man himself and his minister. Do you think the South African president is very serious about the SANDF, particularly its funding? You know how he came out and embraced the SANDF when the fight against COVID-19 was embarked upon in the country. He was at a military base in Soweto, addressing the nation in military attire. Is he taking the armed forces of this country serious, or it's just lip service?
So far, I'm afraid it looks as if it's been lip service, because nothing much has happened. There's been talk for a long time, but nothing happens. He has now more recently talked of more than doubling the defense budget. I'm not sure where they're going to find the money. The economy is in such bad shape that we can't really fund what we're supposed to be doing in other departments. So it's going to be tricky. I think he started off well, but also President Zuma, quite honestly, had a good grasp of strategic requirements and was very supportive during the defense review, but then also nothing happened. And the defense force is used to this. Since the late 90s and the arms deal, when we got some very good equipment, I might add, at very good prices, since then pretty much nothing has happened, except the jobs given to the defense force keep becoming more while the funding doesn't keep up. And we're on a one-way slope here. It's not going to be that easy to recover. It's recoverable because we've got the people who can do it, who can turn it around, but it's going to take a lot of money and a fair bit of time.
Should South Africa open up another arms deal procurement venture, particularly noting how outdated the technology and the systems of the SANDF are currently? You look at the deplorable state of state-owned arms company Denel and Armsco. Should they essentially open up that new procurement of arms once again to beef up the SANDF, knowing the polarization of the current political system and the conflicts that are taking place in the world? And Africa is not immune to those particular conflicts, looking at the statements of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, the aggression also of the DRC under President Tshisekedi, and ultimately the diplomatic slow aggression and soft aggression of the South African president.
Look, yes, I think we should be. For instance, at the moment, we are not able to patrol or control our waters. We don't have maritime surveillance aircraft to know what's going on out there. Not even the mainland, let alone Marian Island waters, where there's some valuable fish types. We don't have enough ships to patrol our waters. We do not have surveillance aircraft to patrol our borders. The army at the moment doesn't have the funding to put 22 companies on the border, which they reckon is the minimum. They've only got 15 there, instead of which we put 2.7 billion into sending troops to the Congo on a mission that never had any chance of success anyway. Instead of, for that matter, also doing something about the insurgency in Cabo Delgado, which is right next door, and could threaten our electricity supply from Cahora Bassa, and if it spreads further south, our current gas supplies from Mozambique, and certainly could unhinge, derail the future gas supply from the gas fields in Cahora Bassa, in Cabo Delgado. So there are things we should be doing, but we can't do them because we don't have the equipment, we don't have the money. I'm not saying go for massive expansion of the armed forces. A lot of the equipment we have, we can upgrade. And a lot of that can be done by local companies. We have the people, we still have a lot of the engineers. Some engineers who emigrated because nothing was happening might well come back. But it needs to be done, and it is not going to be cheap. To illustrate something there, the previous government made the same set of mistakes way back when. After the Republic, they decided they would never go to war for the Brits again, so they scrapped half the tank fleet. They didn't bother to buy much. They bought a few aircraft to keep the Air Force happy and a few ships to enable them to get the British out of Simonstown. But by the time they went into Angola in 1975, Operation Savannah, for instance, the Army's artillery was the same that they brought out of Italy in 1945. Then came a massive re-equipment program, which would have finished about 95 if the funding hadn't been cut from about 89. It's going to take 10 years to get this defense force reasonably functioning. It's going to take at least 20 to rebuild some sort of regional capability.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heitman. That was Mr. Heitman basically speaking on the state of the SANDF, saying budget cuts have ultimately led to where the SANDF is currently now, saying that if South Africa or the SANDF were to go back to its former glory, it needs about 10 years for the equipment and ultimately to be respected once again, to be able to fulfill its international mandates of its operations of deep sea overseeing, particularly against pirates and illegal fishing. They need about 20 years for that. I remember at some point the former Minister of Defense, Ngakula, had an issue particularly where South Africa was not meeting its international obligation, particularly due to deep sea overseeing of South Africa's roles of the SANDF, knowing to the failure of the SANDF equipment. But with President Cyril Ramaphosa largely engaged in international affairs, particularly in conflict countries, he really needs a strong SANDF and particularly defense in the country. It reminds me of when we were meant to go to Russia, Ukraine, and ultimately we're in a plane in Poland, and the heavy weaponry that was currently there, particularly of the Presidential Protection Services of the country. And that did not escalate or extend to the SANDF. So one wonders how many heavy machinery were actually on that SAA aircraft that we were using, looking at the dilapidated state of the SANDF. But in the words he's expressing and exchanging with President Paul Kagame, one looks like he will definitely be looking at giving the SANDF a huge slice of the pie, particularly when the Minister of Finance delivers that budget speech in towards the end of February.
And it's interesting, Samgera, that all of this happens ahead of the State of the Nation address. So one wonders if anything will be said about that as a precursor to what we hear then from the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana a little later on. That's Samgera Masego there, taking a look at the funding issues when it comes to the budgets around the SANDF.